All right, let's begin the show with what we're expecting to be a critical public hearing of the January 6th committee. Republican election officials who say former President Trump tried to convince them to overturn the 2020 election results will appear before committee members. One of the witnesses is Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, who you recall had this phone call with then President Trump.
I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have.
All right, let's bring in Congressional Correspondent Nikole Killion, who has more for us on this. Nikole, give us some insight into the significance of Brad Raffensperger, his expected testimony. What are we expecting to hear?
Yeah, well, it is significant. I mean, who could forget that phone call? It's something I certainly remember covering it in real time in the days leading up to January 6th. And, you know, look, I mean, in terms of Brad Raffensperger, he's met with the committee. We do know that it occurred a couple of months back. And so in terms of his testimony, we expect him to talk more about this effort and this pressure campaign by the former president and even some of his closest advisors like Mark Meadows to try to help overturn the results of the election. As we know, Brad Raffensperger stood his ground. He did not give in to the president's desires and was pretty frank with him that, you know, there really wasn't much that he could do to try to find votes, if you will, that, you know, the election results were what they were. So we expect to hear more from the Georgia Secretary of State on that front, in addition to a number of other state and local election officials, and state legislators for that matter. But look, we know the committee will, in essence, lay out once again this narrative that the former president just didn't listen, you know, that he kind of pursued these various courses to try to overturn the election, whether it was trying to pressure his own vice president or today, as we will hear in this case, trying to pressure these state and local officials, whether it was in Georgia, whether it was Michigan, Pennsylvania, and other states to try to get the election to go his way.
So, Nikole, some of these election officials, we've already heard from them. They've spoken publicly about their interactions with the president. But we're also going to hear from an election worker. Can you tell us more about her?
Yeah, so in terms of this election worker, what we expect to hear from her is just kind of some of the damages and grievances that she and her family have suffered in the wake of some of these false election claims that, you know, by the former president and some of his associates, in essence, alleging that she and other election workers may have committed election fraud, that she has, you know, suffered as a consequence of that. In fact, at one point, I know she has filed a defamation lawsuit. This is Wandrea Shea Moss. She filed a defamation lawsuit against a conservative media outlet because they were purporting that, again, she and other workers had engaged in some type of fraud. And so it has been a challenge for her and for her mother. So we expect this to be some pretty personal testimony about how some of these claims have directly impacted her. And we know, kind of in the wake of all of this, just generally speaking, you know, the concerns of many election workers and their safety and security has kind of started to become a greater issue in the wake of how the 2020 election played out.
Let's turn to former Vice President Mike Pence for just a minute, Nikole. The former VP spoke with Fox News on Monday, and he accused Democrats of using January 6th to distract from what he called, quote, their failed agenda. He also praised former President Trump's record as president, a shift from his past rebellions against President Trump. What do you think is motivating this?
You know, look, it's no surprises here that the former vice president kind of is walking this tightrope, if you will. Certainly, it's possible that he may have aspirations for 2024. We have seen him out doing a number of speeches, most recently in Illinois, you know, where he addressed the economy. But this is something where, you know, while the former president has sought to, in some aspects, maintain his distance from the former president, at the same time, should he have future political aspirations, he will, in essence, need some of that same base. So I think in terms of his comments, that's kind of what you're seeing him play to, because he can't completely alienate the Trump base or the Republican base for that matter. So from that standpoint, I think that's why the former vice president kind of went after President Biden, which many Republicans are doing right now. But it is a little stunning considering some of the testimony from last week where, again, the committee laid out in pretty orderly detail how the former president and, again, some of his legal associates really tried to push the former vice president to overturn the results of the election to the point where they say it did pose a danger to his life on January 6th when you had those folks in the crowd yelling, "Hang Mike Pence." So it is a little bit of like I said, a stunning development. But on the same token, again, the former vice president still has a record that he wants to run on, so he can't totally trash the former president and the administration, right? And I think many of his aides would also acknowledge there were many successes from the last administration. So while the former vice president likes to focus on that and probably will continue to do so, he does have to kind of walk this fine line in terms of how he refers to the former president as well as this investigation as it plays out.
Yeah, it'll be interesting though to see. He's on a friendly network, right? He's doing an interview on a friendly network where they're probably not going to ask him the questions that perhaps another journalist, another reporter from an organization that is not friendly to him, in other words, objective, would ask. And it'll be interesting to see how he answers those direct questions when asked directly about people who wanted to allegedly kill him, or the former president who reportedly, according to the January 6th committee,
did nothing to help him.
Right.
Did nothing to help. What I kept on thinking about the testimony is he was praised over and over and over again during that committee hearing for doing the right thing, for being courageous, for resisting President Trump's pressure tactics. And at any other time, any other universe, that would be almost the basis of a campaign ad.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And now it's not. Now it's actually sort of, I don't know the impact it would have on his political aspirations.
And knowing, just the way the former President Trump behaves, I mean, this is playing into his, he sees, and he's called Pence someone who did not do the right thing. He said that over and over and over again. So Mike Pence can get up on any stage and say, well, I did the right thing, but his former boss says, no, you didn't.
Right, exactly. I'm sorry, Nikole, we just went on a rant.
Yeah, but
you springboarded a whole conversation.
No, again, it's very fascinating, and actually, I believe the former vice president has a book coming out later this year, so we'll see. And I'm sure as he stays, continues to do these appearances, these will be questions that will continue to dog him throughout.
We've just been reminded that it will be published by Simon & Schuster, which is a division of Paramount Global.
Right, that's right, which means that he will most likely appear on our air.
Yeah,
so we'll see.
Should be interesting. Nikole, thank you.
Well, I hope you guys get the exclusive.
We'd like to see that happen too, Nikole. Something tells me, though, probably not.
Well, today's public hearing begins at 1 p.m. Eastern. We will have full coverage all day, and you can stream the testimony live right here as part of a CBS News special report.